Back in February of this year, Canadian North Airlines launched a new route between Calgary, Alberta and Yellowknife, Northwest Territories. Canadian North is the largest airline in northern Canada and serves the Northwest Territories and Nunavut through their hubs in Yellowknife and Iqaluit, respectively. They use a fleet of ATR-42s and now some ATR-72s, which mostly stay up north, plus several Boeing 737s, which help link their network to the larger cities in the south. However, their presence in Calgary, especially in recent years, has been limited to charter flights specifically. Their only scheduled commercial flights in Alberta have usually taken place out of Edmonton, and so this new route is very convenient. Back in April, I needed to get to Yellowknife for one last ride on their 737-200 before it was retired. With the launch of actual scheduled flights right from home, and knowing how good Canadian North's onboard service can be, I knew this was a flight I had to try. The other bonus is that this flight will be taking place on one of the newest aircraft types in their fleet, this 18-year-old Boeing 737-700, registered as Charlie Foxtrot Hotel Bravo Oscar. This very plane was the first 737 next generation to join Canadian North. As a well-established 737 operator, having flown the 200s for decades, and still a sizable number of 300s and 400s, the addition of the 737NG was a pretty big deal for the company. The first two NGs officially entered service in 2021, and they're now up to 4 700s. This airplane specifically, though, is no stranger to YYC. Canadian North's first 3 737-700s are all former WestJet planes, and this one flew in teal colors from 2005 up until the end of 2020. Right around the same time in 2020, Canadian North signed a letter of intent with Air Greenland to explore some potential connections between Greenland and Canada. The 737-700s were specifically mentioned as being able to fly directly from Toronto to Greenland's capital city of Nuuk, although nothing seems to have materialized just yet. I know I'd be all over a flight like that. But that's hopefully something for the future with these planes. In the meantime, let's head to Yellowknife. Stepping on board the 737-700, it is pretty easy to tell where this plane flew last, since Canadian North has essentially kept the same cabin, except for the WestJet premium seats. My seat for today's flight north is near the back in 17A. As far as all economy 737s go, the legroom is pretty average, and doesn't seem much different from normal WestJet. Row 17 does have this nice view behind the wing though. Since these are the same WestJet seats, they have the usual literature pocket at the top, a tray table, and a small seatback pocket, but what's new for Canadian North are the power outlets. Very shortly after I sat down though, boarding was complete, with only about 40 passengers or so. That may have just been because it was a slower day in mid-April, but I certainly hope it's a little busier than this throughout the summer. I have to imagine that there'd be a decent amount of cargo on a route like this though, and the 737 can certainly carry more than the Dash 8s that usually fly this route. Speaking of which, that may almost be the biggest upgrade of them all. Calgary to Yellowknife is one of the longest Dash 8 400 routes in the country, at almost 2.5 hours. Ironically though, WestJet also still flies it with their own 737s during the summer season, which is kinda funny to think that the only physical difference with these planes is the fact that they're now painted red. But, like I alluded to before, the onboard service on Canadian North was bound to be far superior, and it sure was. After getting the flare treatment on the west de-ice pad, we were finally off to Yellowknife, and here's the takeoff from runway 35 right. Calgary to Yellowknife is just under a 2-hour flight, heading pretty much directly north. And since we took off on one of the 35s and landed straight in on 3-4 in Yellowknife, we made just a few shallow turns the entire flight. With that though, I'll take a better look around the seat. In front is this sturdy tray table that slides, and in the literature package is the safety card for the 737-700, some air sickness bags, and this pamphlet promoting the Calgary to Yellowknife service. On here, they mention a few of the major selling points, like the daily flights, complimentary meal service, more on that later, a free checked bag, and the faster flight time on the 737 versus the Dash 8s that the other two would fly, or used to. A big part of Canadian North launching this route in the first place was Air Canada cutting a pile of jazz routes out of Calgary, especially Calgary to Yellowknife. That seems to have opened the door for Canadian North a bit, although a 737 does have quite a few more seats to fill. While I was filming that last bit, our cabin crew went by handing out these hot towels. I was not expecting that in economy class of all things. And finally, the thing I was most looking forward to was Canadian North's in-flight meal. This was a roast beef wrap that came with a small salad and chocolate square. That also came with a full can of Pepsi. Honestly, pretty mind-blowing that this is what they give on a domestic Canadian flight in economy class. All of this came on this nice-looking placemat too. Canada's Northern Airlines really set the bar high for this sort of service, and today's flight was no exception. Now, the reason a free meal on a domestic Canadian flight is a big deal is because even on full-fare carriers, the standard for economy is usually just free non-alcoholic beverages and then some food for purchase only, even on the 5 to 6 hour flights. So to get all of this on a flight less than 2 is phenomenal. Now, Canadian North doesn't have entertainment or Wi-Fi on their 737-700s, but it wasn't hard to figure out where we were as the prairies turned into the forests of northern Alberta. Prior to this, my last proper flight with Canadian North, not counting wet leases, was back in 2019, and obviously things have changed quite a bit since then. Aside from global events, their merger with First Air went through, which meant that the combined company took on the new First Air livery as their branding going forward. I am a big fan of the old Canadian North livery though, so as sad as I am to see the polar bear go, I can't deny that that red winglet looks very sharp. Canadian North 737-700 seats 138 passengers in that all-economy configuration. They obviously don't have the first 3 rows of premium like WestJet had, but I suspect those rows might have kept the extra legroom. Other than that though, it does feel pretty familiar. However, if they were to replace the teal stripe on the overhead bins with a Canadian North red one instead, that might make it feel less like WestJet. But then again, the average passenger is probably not going to notice anyway. There are 2 lavatories at the very back of the plane that are still a normal size. Although the 737 Classics have more comfortable padded seats, the power ports are a definite upgrade. I'm sure people were happy to see those. As if the meal service wasn't enough, Canadian North had another surprise in store, with these warm chocolate chip cookies. Those smelled and tasted unbelievable, and were perfectly soft the whole way through. The crew also came through the cabin with Canadian North's special coffee with whipped cream on top. What a great way to top off this whole flight. For what it's worth, I took the same route back home, and they also had a ton of food for breakfast that day too. They also handed out the cookies again, but the ovens weren't working on that plane just yet, so they weren't warm. Still delicious though. That flight also happened to be on Canadian North's 4th 737-700, which came from Aeromexico instead of WestJet, hence the different seats. The rest of today's flight though was pretty uneventful, and we passed over the Peace River and more of northern Alberta before eventually crossing the 60th parallel and starting our descent just over the southern shore of Great Slave Lake. Here's the arrival into Yellowknife, landing on runway 34.
safety, please remain in your seat with your seatbelt fastened and your personal belongings stowed.
Well, that was Canadian North 737-700 and their new route from Calgary to Yellowknife. As far as domestic Canadian economy class flights go, that may have been one of the most enjoyable ones I've ever had. That level of service was unbelievable, and I would argue might even be better than some premium or business classes out there. I do genuinely hope this route sticks around though. It is such a nice way to get to the Northwest Territories. One thing I have noticed recently is that Canadian North has added a stop in Edmonton on some of these flights, possibly to pick up more people or cargo. That would add a bit more time on board, but in fairness, that's exactly what Air North does on their flights from Whitehorse to Calgary and Edmonton anyway. Besides, even with a stop in Edmonton, I don't think anyone can deny how seriously impressive the onboard offering is. Provided it sticks around, I would happily use this flight again sometime in the future. Thanks for watching this very enjoyable flight with Canadian North, and I'll catch you next time.